Imagine a world where journalists couldn't paste gate behind every single political drama. We'd have to find new names for a long list of events. It's no exaggeration to say that the journalists of the Washington Post who uncovered the Watergate scandal had a significant impact on modern history and how we label it. That, and, that other thing. But that wasn't the only time that journalism had a serious impact. So here are 5 events when journalists changed the course of history. Number 1. Reporting from Crimea. The Crimean War, fought between France, Britain, Sardinia and the Ottoman Empire on one side and Russia on the other, was the first conflict with modern explosives, rapid communication and railway, and is widely considered to be the first modern war. However, it was mostly known for its complete lack of cause and competence. More importantly though, it was one of the first wars that was so extensively covered by reports and photographs due to technological advancements. Before this conflict, it could take reports a week to reach the public. This was reduced to a mere 2 days by the end of the war. One journalist in particular made headlines: William Howard Russell, widely regarded as the first modern war correspondent. This drinking and cigar-smoking Irishman befriended junior officers, stayed close to the common soldier, and analyzed the evolution of the war. He informed the public at home about the absurdness of the war, the appalling conditions and complete neglect of the sick and wounded, and above all, the utter incompetence of the commanders and their military blunders. His extensive writing didn't go unnoticed. Florence Nightingale credited Russell's dispatches as the reason she traveled to Constantinople to take care of the wounded. His work forced the British government to drastically improve wartime medical care, which would have a lasting global effect. Russell reported extensively on the siege of Sevastopol and the terrible living conditions of the besieging soldiers. This inspired Samuel Morton Peto and his partners to build the Grand Crimean Central Railway, an important element in the final success of taking the city. He also extensively covered Mary Seacole and saved her medical initiative. The backlash of the public on how the war was fought finally led to the downfall of the government of George Hamilton Gordon. He even got the attention of Queen Victoria, who described his dispatches as infamous attacks against the army which have disgraced our newspaper. Russell was not the only one with a good pen in Crimea though. A Russian author regularly sent out dispatches back home describing in detail his experience while defending the city. His name is Leo Tolstoy. Number 2. The Birth of an Ancient Nation. We were 1876 and journalism had matured considerably, as did the map of Europe. As Irish-American journalists near the end of the 19th century, Januarius Aloysius MacGahan had already reported from Paris, St. Petersburg, Central Asia, Cuba, the Arctic and the Caucasus. It was famous for its impartiality, tenacity, but above all, to be one badass correspondent. In 1876, MacGahan was commissioned by the British Daily News to double-check a report they had published. The article dealt with a possible atrocity committed by Turkish forces in southern Bulgaria, part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. The British government, on good footing with the Ottoman Empire, denied everything and demanded a retraction, as did the Ottomans themselves, obviously. What MacGahan found was gruesome: the butchery of more than 12,000 Bulgarian men, women and children. In the town of Batak, 5,000 had been slaughtered, beheaded or burned alive, and their bodies left in piles around the town square and the church. He reported his findings in vivid detail and moving words back to London, where it was published by the Daily News and eagerly picked up by other newspapers. One report ended with, "The harvests are rotting in the fields, and the reapers are rotting here in the churchyard." The response was direct as it was strong. There was a Europe-wide indignation, and the British government nearly fell after having to admit that they had been wrong. Hundreds of rallies and meetings in defense of the Bulgarians were organized in Britain. The pressure for military intervention built up, especially from Russia, who had been waiting for an opportunity to bypass the Treaty of Paris of 1856. With public opinion squarely against the Ottoman Empire, the British were unable to stand by their ally when Russia declared war in 1877. In Bulgaria, MacGahan is revered as a national hero, as his revelation of the massacre indirectly led to the independence of Bulgaria after the Russo-Turkish War. Number 3. The First War in Technicolor. It is often said that the USA lost the Vietnam War at home against the press. The theory goes that if it wasn't for the constant negative reporting, the public wouldn't have put so much pressure on the government to put an end to the conflict. Now, it would take a 6-hour documentary to decently analyze the role of the press, so we're going to slightly limit ourselves to 3 significant events. Now, initially, the press dutifully followed the overall positive narrative presented by US military. However, reporters soon realized that this positive picture was considerably stretching the truth. Intelligence about body counts were obviously heavily inflated, and the idea of winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, well, didn't really work out all that great. While New York Times journalist David Halberstam wasn't the only one to break press ranks, he was one of the first to literally pen down his visibly negative impressions of the conflict, questioning the effectiveness of the South Vietnamese government, US aid, and simply overall success. This large, impressive reporter had no patience for bullshit and is said to have blown a fuse on more than one occasion when he felt that US military was not taking him seriously. He even got President Kennedy to request his removal from Saigon. Throw to the credit of the New York Times, they kept him right there. A second turning point was the reporting of the My Lai massacre by independent reporter Seymour Hersh. This black page of the Vietnam War entailed the butchery of between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese women, children, and elderly by US troops. What is especially disturbing was that 5 other journalists and editors had known about the story before Hersh, but simply refused to print it. Moreover, Hersh was turned down by 2 publishers before the Washington-based Dispatch News Service published it. The third turning point were the famous Pentagon Papers. These classified documents were first leaked by Daniel Ellsberg to New York Times journalist Neil Sheehan and later to the Washington Post. These further illustrated that the USA had been systematically lying about progress in Vietnam. The story about an ineffective and unnecessary war that was fought with questionable methods was complete. The public opposition to the war, fueled by the media, forced the US government to end its involvement in Vietnam. Number 4, the one we already mentioned. Watergate, one of the most famous victories of the press against a sitting leader. This is the story with intrigue, espionage, corruption, C-movie story plots, and finally, the fall of the President of the United States of America. It starts on June 17, 1972, at the Watergate Hotel Complex. 5 people were apprehended for breaking and entering. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post investigated the break-in and noticed the professionalism of the burglars. More disturbingly though, one of them was on the payroll of Nixon's re-election committee. A small note to presidential hopefuls: don't fund your questionable activities with election campaign money. It's illegal and it tends to leave a trail. Now, gradually Woodward and Bernstein uncovered a story resembling a John Grisham political thriller. It had the government deeply involved, a mystery man in a deserted car park, shady connections, unaccounted for funds, mismatched testimonies, and a $25,000 check from Nixon's re-election campaign. Irregardless of governmental pushbacks and threats, the dominoes kept falling and couldn't be stopped anymore. The most surprising revelation came in July 1973. Nixon had recorded all his conversations and phone calls. Can I intervene here for a second again? Why though? Why would he tape himself committing obviously impeachable offenses? I wouldn't accept that plot in some neo-noir B-movie. But I digress. After Nixon proved himself to be a terrible C-movie villain, support mysteriously waned and the infamous Saturday Night Massacre took place, where various high-ranking governmental officials were fired because they were unwilling to support Nixon. When the president declared at a press conference, "I am not a crook," more than a few Americans raised their eyebrows skeptically. On June 23, 1974, after weeks of unrelenting pressure, Nixon finally released the tapes. A good month later, on the evening of August 8, Nixon resigned. Number 5. Time to go global. How would you get the world record of biggest email attachment in the history of email? Well, you collect 2.7 terabytes of highly sensitive data about global tax evasion and you send it over to 2 journalists. The recipients of this wealth of information were the German journalists Bastian Obermaier and Frederik Obermayer of the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung. The data focused on the Panamanian company Mossack Fonseca, who had created shell companies for numerous organizations and private figures. Some had perfectly valid legal reasons. Others were a bit shadier. Together with the help of 300 journalists from 107 media organizations, spread all over 80 countries and organized by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Obermaier and Obermayer went through the files. Now, in a nutshell, the Panama Papers contain 11.5 million documents, 2.7 terabytes of data, mentioning 214,000 companies. It deals with weapon trade, drug trafficking, whitewashing, tax fraud, bribery, financial fraud, and child prostitution. Some specific examples are arms deals to Syrian Air Force, tax evasion by an Ugandese oil company, and the Andorran blood diamond trade. 15 current or former world leaders are mentioned, Putin amongst them. The EU Commissioner estimates a yearly loss of some €1 trillion in public finances for the member states of the European Union, and Europol has reported 3,469 probable matches to criminal and terrorist organizations, and all this from an anonymous source. Now, the impact has been wide as it has been global. Now, besides the obvious wealth of information for investigative journalism and criminal investigations, it also led to the resignation of the Icelandic Prime Minister as well as an Energy and Industry Minister. The leader of Argentina is under criminal investigation, and the former Prime Minister of Pakistan received 10 years of prison time. There are numerous other governmental officials across the globe who are also under investigation. The FIFA director and other employees had to resign. Thousands of taxpayers and companies are under investigation. Global changes in taxation laws and pressure when changes are procrastinated. Multiple countries launched investigations and brought criminal charges, resulting in well over $1.2 billion in received fines and taxation. And finally, there is transparency into the debt of tax evasion by the wealthy. There are, of course, many more journalists that have profoundly influenced the direction the world took. Veronica Guerin's investigation in the Irish drug world changed Ireland's drug-related laws. Günter Wallraff's forced policy changes in Germany with his many undercover investigations that highlighted the horrible conditions that certain parts of German society were living in. Charles Hainley's reporting on the torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. Nellie Bly, who feigned insanity to research the conditions in mental institutions. Aileen Wellsome, who alerted the American Republic about radioactive testing, and so on and so forth. What all these journalists have in common is a diligent characters that stubbornly pursued the truth. It allows us, consumers of the news, to better understand what's going on at home and in the world, and to act and allow the situation to change when it calls for it. It is for these reasons that their work is imperative for a well-functioning democracy. Without these journalists shedding light on world events, and who often put themselves in life-threatening situations, we wouldn't know the truth, and the world would be a darker place.